The Young and the Restless spoilers, full episodes Tuesday, March 3, 2026. Holden Novak's confession to Audra Charles unfolded not as a burst of guilt, but as the inevitable cracking of a carefully constructed facade. One that had been tightening around him since the day he re-entered her orbit under the guise of partnership, opportunity, and shared ambition. Audra, already stretched thin by her endless efforts to maintain control in a world where alliances shifted like sand under her feet, sensed that Holden's tension was no longer the usual pressure of corporate maneuvering. Something haunted him, something heavier than a business misstep, something that lingered in the way his eyes avoided hers even when he spoke confidently about strategy. When the truth finally emerged, it did not come as a dramatic explosion, but as a slow unraveling, the kind that destabilizes the ground beneath both people involved. Holden confessed the secrets he had been hiding, secrets that carried consequences far beyond personal embarrassment. Audra listened, her posture rigid, her face composed, but internally she catalogued every detail, every implication, every threat this revelation posed to her plans. She had built her identity on forward momentum, on refusing to let anyone, least of all a man, complicate her trajectory. Yet Holden's honesty forced her to reconsider the precarious balance of trust and manipulation that shaped their connection. She understood that confessions were never gifts. They were always leverage, warnings, or pleas for absolution. And in Holden's case, it felt like all three at once. Meanwhile, Claire Newman found herself in an emotional landscape no less complex, one shaped by the fragility of newfound belonging and the shadows of her turbulent past. Speaking with Kyle Abbott became less of a choice and more of a necessary release. As her thoughts spiraled around the uncertainties of her place in the Newman family and the ghosts that lingered behind every attempt she made to move forward, Kyle, despite his own flaws, had a gentleness in the way he listened, allowing Claire to unravel the tight knot of fear and guilt she carried without judgment. For the first time in her adult life, Claire admitted aloud the weight of being someone others expected to break again. Someone whose every step toward recovery was scrutinized for signs of relapse or instability. Kyle understood better than she expected. His own life had been shaped by legacy, by expectation, by the pressure to represent a family name even when personal identity struggled to fit within those confines. Their conversation brought Claire a sense of grounding she had not known she needed. In Kyle she found not a savior, but a mirror person who knew what it felt like to carry burdens passed down through generations. The emotional intimacy between them grew quietly, subtly, and yet unmistakably, forming a new thread in the tapestry of relationships connecting the Newmans and Abbotts in ways neither family fully anticipated. Victoria Newman, meanwhile, found herself fighting a different battle, one of inner endurance and outward resolve. Her promise to Nikki, given with steady eyes and unwavering conviction, came not from a place of blind optimism, but from the hardened resilience she had cultivated over a lifetime of navigating love, betrayal, heartbreak, and professional warfare. Nikki had always believed in her daughter's strength, but this time she needed reassurance that Victoria would not surrender to emotional fatigue or let her struggles with her children, her career, or her complicated romantic history erode her determination. Victoria's vow was not a simple gesture, it was a declaration that she would continue to rise, continue to fight, and continue to shape her destiny, even when the world seemed determined to unravel everything she built. Nikki, though relieved, also knew that promises born in moments of vulnerability could become burdens later. But she chose to trust that her daughter's fire, burning quietly but fiercely, would carry her through the turmoil ahead. And while these threads shaped the emotional undercurrent of Genoa City, another storm brewed within the walls of Billy Abbott's home. Where he prepared a dinner that he hoped would redefine the future he still believed possible with Sally Spectra. The soft glow of candles, the music selected with intention, the air carefully crafted to evoke warmth and nostalgia, every detail reflected Billy's desire not just to impress Sally, but to remind her of the version of themselves that had once felt effortless and full of promise. Sally entered with caution draped around her like armor, prepared for closure, for the polite and distant conversation two adults have when love fades and both must accept it. But Billy refused to let her leave with only grief and finality. He wanted honesty, real, unfiltered honesty, even if it meant exposing the parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. He urged her to share the truths they had both hidden behind defensiveness and disappointment. And Sally, caught off guard by his sincerity, found herself speaking of her father, a man who had spent his life chasing dreams so grand they collapsed under their own weight. She described the pattern of hope followed by failure, the cycle of anticipation and heartbreak, the repeated lessons that taught her to stop believing in big promises. Sally's voice faltered as she admitted that, although Billy was not her father, the resemblance was undeniable. Ambition that swung wildly, passion that burned hot, but inconsistently. A tendency to leap, without thinking about the consequences for those who loved him. She confessed that she could no longer endure the emotional turbulence of loving someone who reminded her so much of the man who taught her what disappointment felt like. Billy, refusing to be dismissed as merely another echo of her past trauma, pushed back gently but firmly. He suggested that maybe her father had failed not because of flaws in his dreams, but because he had never been given the foundation of belief that a person needs to rise instead of collapse. But Sally, stung by the implication, interpreted his words as blame, another reminder of how easily her choices, her faith, and her pain were questioned by others. She confronted him with the reality that he had chosen Chancellor over her after countless conversations about their future, proving her fears right. Billy countered that his choice had never been against her, but made alongside what he believed was the vision they could share. Yet the gap between intention and perception remained wide, and each step they took deeper into the conversation revealed how wounded both of them truly were. As Billy pushed for reconciliation, Sally felt the room grow heavier with memories of promises unkept and futures imagined, but never realized. She remembered the moments where Billy's spontaneity charmed her, where his impulsiveness seemed like potential rather than danger. But she also remembered the unpredictability, the instability, the feeling of standing on uneven ground while hoping it would someday become solid. The dinner that Billy intended as a rekindling began to feel like a crossroads, one where neither choice offered certainty, only different variations of risk and vulnerability. Sally felt torn between the desire to believe once more and the instinct to protect herself from repeating old wounds. Billy, sensing her conflict, stepped further into emotional exposure, willing to show her parts of himself he had long kept hidden. His voice held none of the bravado he often used as deflection. Instead, it contained a rawness that came from genuinely fearing the loss of someone who had reshaped his understanding of connection. Across town, Holden's confession continued to reverberate in Audra's mind, creating an unexpected emotional echo that made her rethink the structure of her alliances. The truth he revealed placed her at a crossroads of her own, whether to exploit the confession for her advantage, distance herself to avoid collateral damage, or maintain their connection in a way that tied them together through mutual vulnerability. Audra, though fiercely independent, recognized the unique danger of caring for someone whose past could compromise her future. But she also understood the rare value of being trusted with truths that others would dare not share. Holden's fate in her hands made her feel powerful, but it also made her wary, knowing that emotional leverage could cut both ways. Claire, still carrying the weight of her conversation with Kyle, confronted a fragile but critical shift within herself. She had allowed honesty to surface, had permitted herself to be seen not as a project, a rehabilitation case, or a fragile soul seeking redemption, but simply as a person. Kyle's quiet presence and empathy allowed her to begin imagining a version of life where she was not defined by her past, but by the connections she built in the present. Claire's journey toward healing found new momentum, although she remained painfully aware of how easily progress could fracture under pressure. Her confession to Kyle did not solve her problems, but it acknowledged them, and acknowledgement, she realized, was its own form of liberation. At the ranch, the air felt unusually heavy as Victoria stood near the windows, staring out at the quiet landscape that stretched across the Newman property. The place that had soothed her through countless rises and falls, yet now failed to offer the clarity she sought. When Nikki approached, expecting to hear updates about her daughter's upcoming trip to Milan, Victoria surprised her with a quiet but firm statement: she was postponing the entire journey. It wasn't an impulsive decision or a gesture rooted in indecision. It came from a deeper place, from an instinct that told her she could not leave Genoa City yet. Not when too many fractures were running through her family all at once. As she sat with her mother, her voice took on a somber tone as she spoke about Nick, explaining that something inside him seemed increasingly unsettled. She described the way he looked at her, how there were moments when she stared into her brother's eyes and could no longer find the familiar man who had once stood beside her through every crisis. Instead, she saw someone struggling against shadows, someone fraying at the edges, someone who felt dangerously unlike the brother she had known all her life. Nikki listened with the aching concern of a mother who had sensed the same shift but tried to believe it would pass. She admitted that she and Victor had talked about Nick, both recognizing the volatility building inside him, the rage, the desperation, the obsessive determination to eliminate Matt Clark once and for all. To Nikki, every sign pointed to a man losing his emotional footing, and Victoria's words only deepened the worrying she carried silently in her chest. The conversation shifted naturally toward Newman Enterprises, the empire that had shaped their identities for decades, the legacy that had become both their anchor and their battleground. Nikki confessed that in quieter moments, she had begun to wonder whether losing everything might not be the worst fate, whether starting over could be a kind of liberation. Maybe the fight had become too heavy. Maybe the cycles of control and crisis had drained them more than they realized. But Victoria, awakened by a deeper fire, rejected the notion immediately. Her voice sharpened with conviction as she told her mother not to surrender, not when so much of what they had built had been taken by manipulation, betrayal, and strategic deceit. She vowed she would not stop fighting, she would not retreat, she would not rest until every stolen piece of their legacy was restored. She spoke as a daughter defending her family, as a leader reclaiming her power, and as a Newman refusing to allow history to be rewritten by anyone else's hands. Nikki saw the determination radiating from her daughter and felt a mixture of pride and fear. Pride because Victoria's resilience had always been formidable. Fear because battles fought from desperation often came with costs no one could predict. Meanwhile, at Crimson Lights, the atmosphere carried a different kind of tension as Holden sat across from Audra, their meeting cloaked in unspoken agendas and half-buried resentments. The smell of coffee and the familiar buzz of the cafe did little to soften the edge in Audra's tone as she questioned him about his trip to Los Angeles. She expected efficiency, results, leverage, anything that would strengthen their position. When Holden admitted that things had not gone smoothly, she immediately assumed Claire Newman had uncovered more than she should have. Her paranoia sharpened each question, each suspicion spiraling into interpretations rooted in mistrust. She accused Claire of following him simply to gather ammunition against them, convinced the young Newman had set her sights on tearing them apart. Audra's fear of betrayal, always simmering beneath her confident exterior, rose quickly to the surface as she insisted Claire could not be trusted. That she would never simply walk away without a plan.